We're going to begin Module 2 by talking about the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're called the Synoptic Gospels because from the Greek word synopsis, which means seeing together. All three of those Gospels have a very high degree of similarity in structure, in content, and in tone. And so many scholars believe that there is some kind of connection between those three Gospels. All of them, in terms of structure, all of them have, they talk about the ministry of Jesus according to a general geographic sequence. They begin with his ministry in Galilee. They talk about, then they move to his withdrawal to the north, which is where Peter's confession happens, which is kind of the climax of the story, of the gospel story, and it's a transition point that then leads to Jesus headed back towards Jerusalem and his ministry in Judea on his way. This structure is a little less clear in Luke, but basically each of those Gospels follows the same sort of pattern, finishing, of course, with Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem itself. Now, by contrast, the Gospel of John actually focuses almost exclusively, or primarily, I should say, on Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem, and doesn't have the same kind of sequence, which we'll talk about that when we get to John. But the problem, or the issue, I should say, that many have wrestled with is why the connection. How do you explain the similarities of the Gospels? Some would say that they all depend on one common source or one common gospel that's no longer available to us, and that each of the authors used that source as a source for themselves as they wrote the gospel. Another theory is that they all depended upon very common oral sources. Obviously, in those days, many stories were passed down by word of mouth, and so those things would have, they had a very rich, or the Jews, I should say, had a very rich oral tradition in terms of how they passed along stories, and so it's possible that they could have come from those oral sources. Another theory is that there's a common dependence on gradually developing written fragments. In other words, these things were being written down, and over time there was a collection of these written stories of Jesus that were used by each of the authors. The probably more likely scenario is that they actually depended upon each other. There's interdependence on each other. In other words, they borrowed from one another. This goes against our own sort of plagiaristic sort of tendencies or understandings in our time today, but for them that would not have been a problem. So a couple of the theories of interdependence, there are some theories even within that. The first one is called the Augustinian proposal, which he thinks that Matthew was written first, and that Mark borrowed from Matthew, and that Luke borrowed from both. The two gospel hypothesis says that Matthew was first, Luke was dependent on Matthew, and then Mark was dependent on both of them. So that one, both of those have Matthew being first. The two source hypothesis says that Mark was first, and that there's another document that's no longer available they call it Q, and that those two were used independently by Matthew and by Luke, and so that they were both dependent upon Mark. Now you say, well, why do they think this? Well, it's because of the commonality in the material. There are some things that are almost exactly the same in Mark as in Matthew. They're almost exactly the same as in Mark as in Luke. And there's some material that is common to both Luke and to Matthew and not to Mark. And so trying to understand which one came first and who borrowed from who has been the source of not a few papers and probably a number of books. So many scholars today believe that Mark was first. However, the historical view is that Matthew was traditionally considered first. There is testimony by Papias, who was the bishop of Hierapolis, from 60 to 163 AD, or that's his lifespan. He is quoted by a later church historian, Eusebius, as stating that Matthew was written first, and so that was sort of the standard understanding for many generations. However, most scholars, as they've dug into this a little bit more, they feel that Mark was first, partly because just for literary reasons. 90% of Mark has a parallel in Matthew, 88% of it in Luke. And so it would make sense that Matthew and Luke would take over Mark's material and expand it a little bit. It would seem strange that Mark would condense the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. That just doesn't seem right. There is verbal agreements among the Gospels. As I've already said, Matthew and Mark both agree frequently with each other, as do Mark and Luke. But Mark seems to be the middle between the three. In other words, the most overlap of material would seem to indicate that Mark was the primary one written. Now, why is that important? I think that really I like to bring this up as a conversation because I think that as we do study the Gospels, it's very interesting to consider why the Gospel writers chose to include certain stories and chose to omit others. And you'll find when you compare accounts between Matthew and Mark and Luke, there are times when there are small phrases and words and small things that are added or subtracted, which I think looking at those things opens up some interesting insights into the thoughts of those that were writing and recording these things. And so it just gives a little bit of depth to our Bible study, and I hope that helps you. Even just thinking about that can help you even as you study the Synoptic Gospels.